Before we get into this one, tell me what city you're listening from, and when it's over, tell me whether you'd rate it a 0 or a 10. The first time Nora Ellis noticed the man across the alley, she told herself she was inventing him out of exhaustion. It was late October, the kind of cold that slipped under window frames and settled inside old bones and drafty buildings, and she had been living in apartment 4C for only 3 weeks. The place was a narrow one-bedroom in a brick building on Waverly Street, with creaking floors, a radiator that hissed like it was arguing with itself, and a kitchen so small she had to open the refrigerator carefully or it would hit the oven door. It wasn't glamorous, but after the divorce and the sale of the house and the humiliating process of starting over at 34, it felt honest. Temporary. Manageable. A place where nobody knew what her married name had been and nobody asked why she still flinched when a door shut too hard. Every night, she sat beside the window with her laptop balanced on one knee and a mug of tea cooling too fast in her hand. She worked remotely for a regional museum, writing grant proposals and donor letters and apologetic emails about budget cuts. The work was stable, which was another word for lonely. Sometimes the only human voice she heard after 6 o'clock came from whatever documentary she put on in the background while she edited sentences nobody would remember by morning. Across the alley stood another brick building, older and darker, with narrow fire escapes running like iron ribs down the front. Most of the windows were curtained or black. A few glowed with the soft yellow of late television. One, on the 4th floor directly opposite hers, stayed dim except for a single lamp set somewhere deep inside the room. The first night she noticed him, the lamp was on, and there he was, a tall man standing near the glass, motionless, his shoulders cut in shadow, his face unreadable from that distance. He did not wave. He did not move away when she saw him. He simply stood there, looking in her direction with such stillness that he seemed less like a neighbor and more like a mark someone had drawn on the dark. Nora frowned, lifted her tea, and stepped sideways so she was no longer directly visible. It was ridiculous how quickly her skin went cold. People looked out windows. She looked out windows. Cities were built on the casual intimacy of strangers seeing each other by accident. But when she leaned back and checked again, he was still there, same posture, same silence, as if he had been waiting for her to confirm he existed. The second night, he appeared at exactly 10:17. That was what made it harder to ignore. Nora only knew the time because she was sending a revised grant narrative to her boss when her attention snagged on movement outside. She glanced up. The lamp flicked on across the alley, and the man stepped into view. 10:17. He stood with one hand braced against the side of the window frame. Watching. Her chest tightened in the irrational, immediate way it had ever since Owen had started reading her messages over her shoulder in the kitchen of their old house. She hated that some part of her still remembered that feeling before her mind caught up. Hated that a shape in a neighboring window could make her body feel 16 again, cornered again, wrong for wanting privacy. She shut her curtains that night. In the morning, under honest daylight, the whole thing seemed absurd. She texted her friend Tessa a picture of the alley and wrote, "I think I have a Victorian ghost or an extremely committed insomniac." Tessa replied in less than a minute. "If he's hot, that's a thriller. If he's not, that's a police report." Nora laughed harder than the joke deserved. Tessa had a husband, 3 children, and a life so loud it spilled through the phone. Nora loved her for it. She also envied it in the private, mean little way people sometimes envy things they are ashamed to want back. That evening she bought heavier curtains at the discount home store on 9th, along with batteries, soup, and a basil plant she knew she would probably kill. By the time she came home, the sky was bruising purple behind the rooftops. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, digging in her tote for her keys, and felt it before she understood it, that old animal prickling at the back of her neck. Someone was looking at her. She turned sharply toward the stairwell window at the end of the hall. Across the alley, 4th floor, same apartment, the man stood in shadow. From here, through old glass and falling dusk, she still could not see his face. But she felt the attention land on her with unnerving precision. Okay, she whispered to no one. No. She let herself into 4C, locked the deadbolt, and installed the new curtains with the determination of a woman who had recently paid too much for a drill she didn't know how to use. It took 45 minutes, one bruised thumb, and an alarming near fall from a dining chair, but when she finished, the window was sealed behind thick charcoal fabric. For 3 nights after that, she did not look. She told herself that was power. Boundaries. Common sense. Then on the 4th night the radiator went quiet, and the apartment became so cold she could see her breath near the glass. Swearing, she crossed the room to check whether the window had opened itself. She pulled the curtain back an inch. The lamp across the alley was already on. He was there. What changed her fear into something stranger was that he was not looking at her face. He was looking lower, toward the right side of her window, as if tracking a detail beside her. His head shifted once, sharply. His shoulders tightened. Then, in a movement so sudden it made her gasp, he slapped his palm flat against the glass. Nora yanked the curtain shut. For a full minute she stood frozen, one hand gripping the fabric so hard her knuckles hurt. Somewhere in the building plumbing groaned. A car alarm chirped in the street and died. Her breathing sounded embarrassingly loud. Then, very softly, something tapped her own window. Not from outside. From inside the room. She turned with a strangled sound and found the culprit immediately, the basil plant, tipped crooked on the sill, one leaf brushing the pane in the draft. Nora let out a laugh that came out shaky and thin. "You're doing great," she told the dying herb. "Really helping." But she didn't sleep well. She dreamed of standing inside a room with windows on every wall while someone circled outside where she could never quite see him. In the dream she always knew exactly when he would knock, and she always woke before he did. The next morning she noticed something she was sure had not been there before. Tucked under the rubber edge of her welcome mat lay a folded square of plain white paper. Her throat dried instantly. She bent, picked it up, and unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Close your blinds before midnight." No signature. No explanation. Just that one sentence, written in dark block letters that looked deliberate enough to hide themselves. Nora stared at it until the hallway seemed to tilt. Then she did what every self-respecting woman with a history of bad instincts and one too many true crime podcasts would do. She locked herself inside, made coffee she forgot to drink, and spent 20 minutes trying to decide whether she was overreacting. At 11:48 that night, she stood in darkness beside the curtained window, the note in one hand, her pulse beating like a second clock in her throat. At exactly midnight, something bright and thin slid across the opposite wall of her living room. Not light from the street. Not headlights. A narrow silver line, moving slowly across her bookshelves, climbing the framed photograph above her couch, and stopping dead at the center of her closed curtains. A reflection. Or the aim of something. Across the alley, the man in the other window was already gone. Nora did not call the police that night because she had no good explanation for what she had seen, and because fear had a way of making her stupid in practical directions. She told herself it could have been a reflection from a windshield, or a drone, or some coincidence that only looked meaningful because of the note under her mat and the stranger in the opposite building and the exhausted state of her own mind. But she kept every light in the apartment off until dawn and sat on the floor between the couch and the coffee table with a kitchen knife beside her and her phone clutched in her hand like a promise she didn't fully trust. At 7 in the morning she finally slept for an hour. At 8:15 the banging of pipes woke her. At 8:17 her phone buzzed with a message from Tessa asking if she still wanted to come over for lasagna on Friday, and Nora nearly cried from the ordinary kindness of it. Instead of texting back, she called. Tessa answered on the second ring. "Well, that can't be good. You only call when you're panicking or when celebrities die." "I think someone left me a note," Nora said. There was a pause on the line. "What kind of note?" "The kind that makes me sound dramatic if I say it out loud." "Try me." Nora did. She described the window, the timing, the man across the alley, the folded paper, the silver line moving over her curtains at midnight. She expected interruption, skepticism, the familiar pressure to calm down. Tessa surprised her. "Take pictures of everything," she said immediately. "The note. The hallway. The angle from your window. And tell your landlord today. My landlord thinks smoke detectors are a government mood disorder." Then tell her louder. By 10 Nora had photographed the note from 6 angles, made tea she once again forgot to drink, and knocked on the super's door downstairs. Mrs. Donnelly, the owner of the building, opened it wearing a floral robe and the expression of a woman who believed all problems were created by younger people making avoidable choices. "What now?" she asked. Nora held up the note. "This was under my mat." Mrs. Donnelly squinted at it, unimpressed. "Could be kids. I don't think kids are conducting surveillance on my curtains." Mrs. Donnelly looked past her, down the hallway toward the stairwell window. "You in 4C? "Yes." That single sound did not comfort Nora. "What does that mean?" "It means the girl before you in 4C complained too." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "Complained about what?" Mrs. Donnelly shrugged, which Nora immediately decided was her least favorite human gesture. "Being watched. Noises. Said somebody was in the alley at night. Wanted me to change the hallway lock. Then she moved out in a hurry." "When?" "Spring." "Did she go to the police?" "No idea." "Do you know her name?" Mrs. Donnelly hesitated long enough to make Nora suspicious. "Ava. Maybe. Something with an A." That was all she would say. When Nora asked about the man across the alley, Mrs. Donnelly glanced once through the stairwell window and clicked her tongue. "That one? Quiet fellow. Been there over a year. Keeps to himself. Pays on time. Not the problem type. You know his name? Julian Cross." The name landed strangely. Too solid for a silhouette. Too human for the shape that had been standing in darkness across from her every night. "What does he do?" Nora asked. "How would I know?" Mrs. Donnelly said, and shut the door. Nora stood in the hallway, the note crinkling in her hand. Julian Cross. The sound of it did not make her feel safer. It made the whole thing more real. That night she came home before dark with pepper spray, a cheap indoor camera she barely knew how to set up, and a metal bar for the apartment door that the cashier at the hardware store had recommended in a tone of practiced concern. She installed the camera facing the front door, tested the pepper spray in the sink after reading the warning label twice, and ate cereal for dinner because the idea of using the stove felt too ambitious. At 10:17 the lamp across the alley turned on. Nora was ready for it this time. She stood behind the edge of the curtain, keeping only one eye to the gap. Julian was there. Taller than she had guessed. Dark hair. Lean frame. The outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Tonight he was not watching her directly. He was scanning, his gaze moving across the building fronts, the fire escapes, the alley mouth below. Twice he looked up, toward the roofline of the abandoned building at the end of the block. The motion was quick, trained almost. Alert. Then his head turned sharply left, not toward Nora's apartment but toward somewhere above it. He vanished from the window. Nora's pulse skipped. A second later she heard footsteps in the hall outside her apartment. Not slow. Fast. Purposeful. The knock that followed was not loud, but it carried a calm certainty that froze her more effectively than pounding would have. 3 knocks. Evenly spaced. Nora stared at the door. The camera feed on her phone showed only a distorted slice of the hallway because she had mounted the thing badly. She could see part of a dark coat, a shoulder, a hand at someone's side. Then a man's voice came through the wood, low and rough as if it wasn't used often. "Miss Ellis. Nora nearly dropped the phone. She had not told anyone in the building her name. "Who is it?" she called, hating the tremor in her own voice. A brief silence. "Julian." From across the alley. Every instinct in her body shouted not to answer. Yet the fact that he had named himself, that he sounded controlled rather than coaxing or drunk, kept her planted there instead of retreating. "What do you want?" Another pause. "To make sure you close your blinds before midnight." Her grip tightened around the pepper spray. "Did you leave that note?" "Yes." "Why?" This time the silence lasted longer. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, sharpened at the edges by something that sounded less like menace than urgency. "Because someone else is watching your window." Nora's mouth went dry. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." "How do you know?" "I've seen the reflection." She thought of the silver line gliding across her wall. "What reflection?" "A lens. Sometimes a sight. Depends on the night." Everything in her wanted to dismiss that answer as manipulative insanity. But there was no theater in his tone. No pleasure. Only strain. "Call the police then," she said. "I did," he replied. "Months ago." They stopped listening. Her apartment felt smaller with every second. "Why are you watching me?" A breath. Then, very quietly, "Because he started watching you 2 weeks ago." Nora could hear the radiator ticking behind her, the hum of her refrigerator, the faint traffic on the avenue. All the ordinary sounds of a life that had suddenly tilted off its axis. "I don't know you," she whispered. "No," Julian said through the door. "That's why I'm knocking now." For a long moment after he left, Nora remained with her hand on the deadbolt, listening to the receding footfalls in the hallway. She did not open the door. She told herself that was smart. Survival was not politeness. But his words stayed in the apartment after he was gone, hanging in the air like smoke that would not clear. "Because he started watching you 2 weeks ago." At 11:30 she turned off every light except the lamp in the kitchen and dragged the dining chair away from the window to break the outline of the room. At 11:57 she stood in darkness again, 1 inch of curtain open, pulse hammering. Nothing happened. Midnight came and passed. No silver line crossed the wall. No movement flashed from the opposite building. The alley below remained empty except for a burst trash bag and a tabby cat threading through shadows near the bins. By 12:20 she felt foolish enough to be angry. Maybe this was Julian's trick. Maybe he had invented a second watcher to make himself seem less threatening, less obsessive. Maybe he had discovered the oldest con in the world: nothing unsettles a woman like telling her there is a worse man than you somewhere in the dark. She went to bed at 1 and slept badly, waking at every sound. At 7:42 the next morning, her phone camera sent a motion alert from the front door. Nora sat up so fast she nearly fell out of bed. On the live feed she saw only the warped corridor and the lower half of someone bending toward the floor. Then the figure straightened and moved out of frame. When she opened the door 3 minutes later, there was no one there. Only a small cardboard box. It was unsealed, plain, and light enough to lift with 2 fingers. Inside lay a new deadbolt chain still in plastic packaging, a flashlight, and a folded note written in the same block lettering as the first. For the door. Use the flashlight only if the power goes out. Do not stand in your window after dark. No signature, but she knew. Some people might have found that comforting. Nora found it infuriating. She took the box straight across the alley. The entrance to Julian's building smelled of damp stone and old newspapers. The hallway light flickered weakly overhead. Apartment 4D was at the far end of the 4th floor corridor, opposite the fire escape window. Nora stood outside it with the box under one arm and knocked harder than necessary. No answer. She knocked again. "Julian?" Nothing. Annoyance gave way to something less stable. She was about to turn away when she noticed the door was not fully latched. It stood open by half an inch. Hello. Still nothing. Every warning she had ever received about women in thrillers entered her brain at once, but so did another fact: if Julian really had left that box and something had happened to him, she would spend the rest of her life hearing the sound of her own shoes retreating. She pushed the door open. The apartment beyond was unexpectedly bare, not empty but stripped down to purpose. A table with maps spread across it. 2 folding chairs. Shelves lined with labeled file boxes. A narrow couch. No television. No clutter. No softness. The window opposite hers was covered not by curtains but by black fabric pinned carefully around the frame so only a narrow observational slit remained open. On the wall beside the table hung photographs. Dozens of them. Windows. Fire escapes. Alley mouths. Rooftops. Long lens shots of brick facades and reflective glass. Some were marked with circles and dates. One showed her own building, centered on the row of 4th-floor windows like an accusation. Nora stopped breathing for a second. Then she saw another photograph beneath it. A woman, younger than Nora by a few years, smiling beside a blonde dog at what looked like a park. Across the bottom, in neat handwriting, were the words Lena Cross, 1994 to 2025. The apartment was too quiet. Julian. A sound came from the bathroom. Not movement. Water dripping. Nora followed it down the short hall, heart in her throat. The bathroom door stood partly open. Inside, Julian sat on the closed toilet lid with his head bowed and a bloody towel wrapped around his left forearm. He looked up the instant she appeared, and surprise cracked his face open into something almost vulnerable. For the first time, Nora saw him clearly. He was younger than she had imagined, maybe 38, with dark hair that fell untidily over his forehead and a sharp, tired face that would have been handsome even without the scar that ran from near his jaw toward the collar of his shirt. His eyes were gray, startlingly pale, and at the moment edged with pain. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Nora stared at the towel. "You're bleeding." "It's not bad." That's what men say before they faint in documentaries. Despite everything, his mouth almost curved. "I'm not going to faint." "What happened?" He hesitated. Someone was on the fire escape. Ice slid down Nora's spine. "Last night?" He nodded once. The room shrank around the word. Someone. Not a theory. Not a reflection. She set the box down on the sink. "Did you see who it was?" "No." "Did they attack you?" "Knife through the gap when I opened the window." He said it so flatly it took a second to understand. "I moved in time." Nora could not feel her hands. "Why didn't you call the police?" "I did." "And?" He gave her a look so exhausted it answered the question better than speech. She crossed her arms hard over her chest, more to keep herself together than out of defensiveness. "You took pictures of my building." "Yes." "You watched me." "Yes." "You left anonymous notes under my mat and put boxes outside my door like a serial killer with boundaries." That almost smile again, gone in a blink. "Fair. And now you're telling me there is some third person watching me from somewhere else." "Yes." Nora pressed a hand over her eyes, then dropped it. "You understand how insane this sounds?" "I do." "Then explain it." For the first time, Julian looked away from her. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, the roughness in his voice deepened, as if dragged over old damage. "My sister lived 3 blocks from here," he said. "Same kind of apartment. Same kind of window. For weeks she thought someone was watching her at night. She told the police. She told her landlord. She told me. I told her she was probably scaring herself." He swallowed. 2 days later she was dead. Nora went utterly still. I started tracking reports after that, he continued. Women living alone. Buildings with clear lines of sight. Complaints about notes, reflections, missing objects, things moved near windows. Most of it never turns into a case because by the time they're taken seriously, whoever is doing it is already gone. The dripping faucet counted seconds between them. Why me? Nora asked. Julian met her eyes. Because I saw the same reflection in your apartment 2 weeks ago. Same angle. Same timing. His next words landed like a door slamming shut. And because yesterday, for the first time, I saw him aiming at your bedroom. Julian insisted on bandaging his own arm. Nora insisted more loudly, and because pain had clearly weakened his ability to argue, she ended up at his kitchen table wrapping gauze around a wound that was longer and deeper than he had admitted. It ran along the outer forearm in a ragged slice. He had cleaned it badly. There were stitches in his future whether he liked it or not. You need urgent care, she said for the third time. I need to stay where I can see your building. You realize that is still an unsettling sentence. I know. His apartment smelled faintly of coffee, dust, and cold air from the sealed window gap. Outside, rain began to tap against the glass in thin, uncertain drops. Nora kept glancing at the photographs on the wall, then away, as if looking too long would force her to accept what they meant. Who are you? She asked finally, tying off the bandage. Julian flexed his hand once, testing it. I used to work private security. Before that, military. Not a glamorous version of either. You say that like there's a glamorous version of private security. There is if you're protecting people on yachts. Nora almost laughed, and the fact that she almost laughed in this room, in this situation, unsettled her almost as much as everything else. What happened to your voice? She asked, then winced at herself. You don't have to answer that. It was damaged years ago. He touched the scar near his throat with 2 fingers, casual as if it belonged to someone else. Talking too much hurts after a while. That explained the silence. Or part of it. The rest looked older than injury. It looked chosen. She sat back. How long have you been doing this? Watching buildings. Watching for him. Julian glanced at the photo of Lena without fully turning his head. Since March. Alone? Yes. That's not investigation. That's self-destruction with a notebook. A faint line appeared between his brows. Possibly. Nora looked around at the file boxes, the marked photographs, the maps. How many women? He answered without needing to count. 9 reports that matched the pattern strongly. For more that might. 2 assaults. My sister. 1 disappearance in Queens that was never connected because she was found 2 days later and the case was classified as an attempted burglary. The rain thickened outside. Down in the alley, water glossed the pavement into a narrow dark mirror. Nora rose and crossed to the wall of photographs, drawn by equal parts horror and need. 1 image showed the reflective gleam of something metallic tucked behind rooftop ductwork. Another captured a distorted male figure in a maintenance jacket exiting a service door at 1:12 a.m. Another showed a laser-thin silver line shining across a darkened room. Why haven't you shown these to a detective who actually cares? She asked. I did. Twice. They said the images were inconclusive and the witness statements were inconsistent. Were they? Yes. He didn't soften it. Fear makes people remember in fragments. Embarrassment makes them minimize. Police like clean stories. And you don't. I like survivors. The words knocked something loose inside her. For a second she could see him not as the silhouette in the opposite window but as the man who had spent months standing still in cold rooms, waiting to catch a pattern no one else believed existed. It did not make him less frightening. It made him more complicated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. You alive? If not, blink twice. Nora typed back, with mysterious hot man. Situation worse than expected. Tessa sent 3 screaming emojis and then, call me now. Nora did not call. She did not know how to begin. At noon Julian walked her back across the alley, despite the rain and despite the fresh bandage on his arm. He stayed 1 step behind her on the sidewalk and 1 pace outside arm's reach in the lobby, as if he understood that trust was not something he could ask for directly. At her apartment door, he handed her a small black device the size of a key fob. What is this? Motion alarm. Press the side if someone gets in. It makes an unpleasant amount of noise. That sounds reassuringly medieval. It works. She looked at him. Clothes like this, with daylight flattening the shadows, he seemed less like an apparition and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. Rain darkened his coat at the shoulders. Water beaded in his hair. He watched the hallway behind her more than he watched her face. If I let you help me, Nora said carefully, that doesn't mean I'm convinced. I know. It also doesn't mean you get to decide things for me. His expression shifted by a degree. Respect, maybe. Understood. And if you ever leave anything under my welcome mat again, I'm assuming the worst. That seems fair. After he left, Nora locked every lock she had, installed the chain from the box, and spent 2 hours researching Ava from Spring. The internet gave her 10 women named Ava within 3 zip codes and 1 missing cat. No former tenant. No obvious warning. Mrs. Donnelly, when cornered by text, did not answer. At dusk the building handyman came by to check the windows. His name was Victor Hale, a broad man in his 50s with soft hands, pale lashes, and a smile that arrived a fraction too late, as if he had to remember where to put it. Nora had seen him twice before in the lobby replacing bulbs. I heard there were concerns, he said pleasantly, glancing around the apartment. From who? Mrs. Donnelly. Said you've been nervous. Old building. Noises. Drafts. He stepped toward the living room window. Every nerve in Nora's body snapped tight. I'm fine, she said too quickly. No need. Victor paused with one hand half raised to the curtain. His smile remained. Just checking the latch. I said no. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes and vanished. Of course. Just doing my job. When he left, Nora shut the door and immediately texted Julian. Handyman just tried to look at my window. The reply came in 20 seconds. Description. She sent one. There was a longer pause this time. Then. Don't let him in again. I'm coming over. The knock arrived less than 4 minutes later. Julian's face was harder than she had yet seen it. He crossed directly to the window, checked the latch, looked down into the alley, then toward the opposite rooftops. His whole body had gone taut with a focused kind of anger. Do you know him? Nora asked. I've photographed him twice near buildings connected to the reports. The handyman? He works part-time for 3 property companies. That doesn't make him a killer. No, Julian said. But it makes him useful to one. The room seemed to dip. You think he's helping whoever this is? I think someone with access has been preparing apartments before the watching starts. Nora felt the blood rush in her ears. Preparing them how? Julian moved to the baseboard beneath the window and crouched. His fingers traced the wood once, twice, then stopped. Very carefully, he slid a flat tool from his pocket and eased up a thin strip of molding. Behind it, hidden in the cavity, was a camera no bigger than a thumbnail. Nora made a sound she did not recognize as her own. Julian removed the camera with 2 fingers and placed it on the table as if handling something poisonous. It was matte black, nearly invisible against the shadowed wood, wired to a battery pack concealed deeper in the wall. Not improvised. Installed. She stared at it while nausea climbed her throat in a slow, burning wave. How long has that been there? I don't know. Could it have been here before I moved in? Yes. The apartment around her shifted from shabby refuge to staged environment with terrifying speed. Her couch. Her books. Her half-unpacked boxes. The nights she had crossed the room in old t-shirts and no bra, thinking she was alone. The mornings she had stood crying by the sink after reading the final paperwork from the divorce. Every private gesture now felt stolen retroactively. Nora turned away and pressed both hands to her mouth. Julian did not touch her. He stayed where he was, still crouched by the wall, as if he understood exactly how dangerous comfort could feel when your space had been violated. Look at me, he said quietly. She hated the authority in the phrase, but obeyed anyway. We have evidence now, he said. That changes things. Does it? Her voice shook. Or does it just mean I've been living in a theater set for a psycho with a maintenance key? His jaw tightened. Both. She gave one breathless, furious laugh and wiped her face before tears could fully arrive. Crying felt too much like surrender. Wonderful. He stood. Pack a bag. What? You shouldn't stay here tonight. Every instinct that valued pride rose up immediately. I'm not running because someone hid a camera in my wall. That isn't running. It's changing the variables. It's my apartment. It's a compromised apartment. The sharpness of his response stopped her. For a second they simply stared at each other in the gathering dark. Nora crossed her arms hard over her chest. Where exactly would I go? With Tessa, if she can have you. Hotel under a different name if not. Anywhere without line of sight to this block. You thought about this already. Yes. That's comforting in a deeply unhinged way. Pack the bag, Nora. The use of her first name landed differently. Less distant. More dangerous. Not because it threatened her, but because some frightened part of her liked how it sounded in his ruined voice. She hated that. Tessa answered before the first full ring. Tell me everything. Nora told her almost everything. Not the camera's exact location. Not the way her knees were still weak. Not the fact that Julian was standing by the door scanning the hallway through the peephole like a man listening for war. But enough. Get here now, Tessa said. You can sleep in the guest room. Ben will pick up Ty. The kids are at my mother's. I swear if you say you don't want to inconvenience us, I'll drive there and carry you over my shoulder. Nora nearly cried for real that time. I'm leaving in 10. She packed fast. Jeans, sweaters, chargers, medication, laptop, toothbrush, the folder with every legal document she still cared about. The ordinary choreography of emergency made everything feel more surreal, not less. When she zipped the bag closed, Julian took it from her automatically. On the way out, she paused and looked back at the apartment. The basil plant drooped on the sill, pathetic and oblivious. The couch blanket was still folded where she had left it. Her coffee mug sat in the sink. Nothing in the room looked different, yet she could not unsee the camera. There was no corner of the place that felt innocent anymore. In the hallway, Julian walked ahead, Nora behind him. At the stairwell landing he stopped so abruptly she almost collided with his back. What? She whispered. He held up one finger. Voices drifted from below. Mrs. Donnelly's reedy tone. Another voice, lower, male. Victor. I told you I haven't seen anything, Mrs. Donnelly was saying. Then why did she ask about the former tenant? Victor asked. Nora felt Julian go rigid. She's nervous. Women alone get ideas. Keep me informed if she leaves. The blood seemed to drain from Nora's body all at once. Julian turned, put one hand lightly against her shoulder, and guided her backward up the stairs without sound. They climbed to the roof access door on the top floor and slipped out into the rain-stung darkness above the building. For a moment Nora could only breathe. "He's downstairs," she whispered. "I know." He told her to keep him informed. "I know. She's helping him." Julian did not answer directly, which was answer enough. The roofs along the block lay slick and black beneath the rain, connected by narrow ledges, iron ladders, and service paths no ordinary tenant would ever notice. Julian moved with practiced certainty toward the far side, where the next building stairs led to a rear exit on another street. "You've done this before," Nora said, trying not to slip. "Yes. With other women?" "Twice." The idea made her stomach clench. "Did it work?" "They survived." That was not the reassuring phrase he perhaps imagined it to be. They reached the back stairwell and descended into a laundry room smelling of detergent and damp cement. From there, a rear alley, then a side street. Only when they reached Julian's parked car, a battered gray sedan with an interior so meticulously clean it felt borrowed from a more stable man, did Nora realize she was shaking. Julian put her bag in the trunk. Rain traced silver lines down his face. "Tessa's address?" She gave it. He nodded and went around to the driver's side. "Halfway there," Nora said, "you knew Mrs. Donnelly was involved." "I suspected." "And you still let me stay there." His hands tightened on the wheel. Streetlights crossed his face in bars of amber and shadow. "I was trying to identify the route in before moving too early. While I lived inside it." "I know." The apology underneath the words was raw enough to quiet her anger for one terrible second. Then she looked out at the rain and said the only thing that felt true. "If you had been wrong about me, I would never have known any of this." "No," Julian said softly. "You would have known it much worse." At Tessa's house, warmth hit Nora like a wall. Garlic, detergent, lamplight, the faint vanilla scent of children who had recently been bathed. Tessa opened the door in socks and fury, took one look at Julian behind Nora, and narrowed her eyes. "If you're the mysterious window man," she said, "I need your full legal intentions before I let you in." A startled sound escaped Nora that was close to laughter. Julian, incredibly, answered, protective, not romantic. Tessa considered him. That answer is somehow both better and more alarming. Ben came down the hall carrying chopsticks and wearing an expression of gentle bewilderment. "Should I be worried?" "Yes," Nora and Tessa said together. Julian did not come inside. He stayed on the porch, rain dripping from his coat, and handed Nora the motion alarm. "Keep this beside the bed," he said. "Do not answer unknown numbers. If anyone comes to the house asking for building access, deliveries you didn't order, or utility checks, call me first. You assume I have your number." He blinked once, then took a pen from his pocket and wrote it on the back of her wrist. The gesture was practical. It should not have felt intimate. It did. "Get some sleep," he said. Nora looked at the ink on her skin, then back at him. "And you?" The porch light caught the scar along his throat. "I'm going back. To my apartment. To watch who comes looking." Nora did not sleep much at Tessa's, though the guest room was warm and safe and painted the soft green of a house where children once used the walls as racetracks for toy cars. She lay awake listening to rain tick against the gutter and to the gentle domestic sounds that had once been background noise in her own life, a toilet flushing in the next room, Ben walking down the hall for water, the low mechanical sigh of a furnace beginning another cycle. Each sound made her realize how deeply she had missed being somewhere that felt inhabited by ordinary affection. At 2:13 in the morning her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her thumb hovered over ignore, then she remembered Julian's warning and let it ring out. 10 seconds later a text arrived from his number. Didn't call. Another message followed. Victor and a second man entered your building at 1:58. Left 2:06. Empty-handed. Nora sat up in bed. Her first instinct was to call. Instead she typed, "Are you safe?" The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, reappeared. "For now." The words did not help. In the morning Tessa cornered her at the kitchen island while Ben got the kids ready for school in a storm of cereal and missing shoes. "I need the version that isn't edited for my blood pressure," she said, pushing coffee toward Nora. Nora gave it to her. All of it this time. The camera in the wall. The former tenant. Julian's sister. Victor downstairs with Mrs. Donnelly. The rooftop escape. By the time she finished, Tessa had gone pale beneath her freckles. "Okay," she said. "We're not doing this halfway. We're going to the police with the camera." "I know. And if they ignore us, I'm calling every local reporter who ever wrote a think piece about tenant safety." Despite herself, Nora smiled faintly into her mug. "I missed you. I'm unforgettable." They took the camera to a precinct downtown at noon. The desk officer glanced at it, asked if Nora had any proof it came from her apartment, and looked unconvinced even after Julian arrived with printed photographs, dates, and a binder of cross-referenced incident reports that made Nora realize he had spent far more of his life on this than she had understood. A detective named Moreno eventually came out, a tired woman in her 40s with a severe bun and eyes that had learned caution from repetition. She listened. That alone felt like progress. But when Julian began laying out his theory of surveillance, access routes, and targeted selection, Nora saw skepticism returning around the detective's mouth. "You've been independently tracking women without reporting every contact," Moreno said. "I reported the incidents, not every apartment I monitored," Julian replied. "Do you see how that sounds?" "Yes. Do you also see how your presence complicates every statement Ms. Ellis makes?" Nora leaned forward. "He found the camera." "In your wall," Moreno said. "In a building where management had access." "Exactly." Moreno folded her hands. "We'll test it. We'll take a statement. We'll request building entry records." Julian's expression did not change, but Nora could feel his distrust harden like cooling metal. "By the time paperwork clears, they'll move." "Maybe," Moreno said evenly. "But if I move without enough, I lose warrants and they disappear anyway." It was the most honest answer they had heard from law enforcement so far, which was somehow both reassuring and awful. Outside the precinct, the sky had cleared to a hard bright blue that felt indecently cheerful. Nora stood on the steps with the city flashing around her, traffic hissing through puddles, and said, "So that's it? We wait?" Julian watched the street the way other people watched conversations. "No. No. We get ahead." She should have objected. She knew that. Instead she heard herself ask, "How?" Julian drove her, not back to Tessa's house, but to a storage facility in Long Island City where he rented a small unit. Inside were more file boxes, a folding cot, cameras, batteries, street maps, and 3 whiteboards covered in dates, names, arrows, and addresses. It looked less like obsession here and more like campaign planning. "This is where you've been working," Nora said quietly. "Yes." She walked slowly along the nearest board. 9 names. Ages. Buildings. Report types. Notes about landlords, supers, maintenance staff, roof access, alley visibility. Under one address was written, "Tenant moved after repeated notes." Under another, "Police classified as peeping complaint." Under her own, "Foresee Waverly, sightline confirmed, interior camera recovered 722, access by V. Hale D. Donnelly probable." "You wrote probable," she said. "It's what I can prove." She turned. "And what can't you prove?" Julian hesitated. "I think Victor is part of the access chain, not the main actor." "The main actor being?" "I don't know. Male, patient, organized, likely uses building staff and vacant units. Watches before entry. Collects information. Sometimes takes souvenirs. Nora's stomach dropped. Souvenirs. He crossed to a file box, opened it, and handed her a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a silver hoop earring. From Lena's apartment, he said. Not hers. Police listed it as probable transfer from prior tenant. Nora stared at the small curve of metal. And you don't believe that? No. The storage unit suddenly felt colder. So what do you want to get ahead of? Julian met her eyes. The next attempt. You mean on me? Yes. She took a step back. Absolutely not. He already adjusted when you changed locations. Victor checked the apartment last night because they weren't sure whether you had left for good. Which means leaving worked. For one night. The white fluorescent light hummed overhead. Somewhere outside, a metal door slammed. Nora folded her arms tightly, trying to contain the shaking that had nothing to do with temperature. I am not bait. I know. That sounded like you were about to say something that starts with hear me out. His gaze flicked away for a fraction of a second. Guilty. Nora laughed once, sharp and joyless. Unbelievable. I'm not asking you to be alone. You are asking me to stand in a room where a man has already been filming me. No. I'm asking you to help me control what he sees. The difference was technical, and she hated that technical differences had begun to matter. Julian moved to the table and unfolded a floor plan of her apartment. Marks in red showed sightlines from the opposite roofs, the alley, the fire escape, and the hallway. We use a silhouette, he said. Not you. Timed lighting. Camera coverage in the apartment and stairwell. Moreno gets an anonymous tip to patrol the block at a specific hour. If they come through management or through the roof, we force contact. Nora looked at the plan, then at him. You've already built this. Yes. Without asking me. Yes. Anger came easier than fear. Do you have any idea how much I hate that? Yes. Good. He did not defend himself. He stood there with exhaustion in his face and stubbornness in every line of his body, and something about that refusal to sweeten the truth made it harder to dismiss him as merely controlling. Nora looked again at the evidence bag with the earring. At her own address on the board. At Lena's smiling photograph clipped near the corner. Tell me exactly what you think happens if I disappear from the pattern completely, she said. Julian answered at once. He shifts to someone else. Nora said yes because she could not bear that sentence. Not because she trusted the plan completely. Not because she thought herself brave. But because once the fear changed shape from mine to someone else's, it became harder to turn away from. She hated that too. Hated that danger could recruit morality so easily. The next 24 hours were spent in preparation. Moreno, once Julian sent her a copy of the interior camera and an anonymous note about suspicious nighttime maintenance activity on Waverly Street, agreed to assign an unmarked car to the block after 11. It was not the full tactical response Julian wanted, but it was movement. Tessa called Nora every 3 hours and alternated between encouragement and detailed threats against Victor's future kneecaps. Ben offered child-safe pepper spray as a joke and then apologized for the phrase child-safe pepper spray as if language itself had failed him. Mrs. Donnelly stopped answering messages entirely. At dusk the following night, Nora rode back with Julian to her apartment. The building looked unchanged. Same rusting mailboxes. Same dim stairwell. Same chipped paint around 4C. That sameness frightened her more now than a visible threat would have. It suggested confidence. It suggested practice. Inside the apartment, Julian moved quickly, checking locks, sealing corners, vents, baseboards, and the window line with a compact intensity that made conversation impossible. He set 3 cameras, one facing the front door, one aimed at the living room from the kitchen, and one concealed low near the window. The silhouette itself was a dressmaker's form borrowed from Tessa's neighbor, draped in Nora's cardigan and positioned beside the curtain with a warm lamp behind it. From the alley, it would look like a woman standing still at her window. "It's creepy," Nora said. "Yes. You say yes to everything like that." "Usually because it's true." She caught him looking at the dress form and then away, the muscle in his jaw flexing once. Even now, in the middle of preparation, grief moved through him like weather. Every staged outline seemed to call up another one. What was Lena like? Nora asked before she could stop herself. Julian's hand stilled over the battery pack he was checking. For a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said, loud. The single word surprised a laugh out of her. She sang badly, he added, eyes still on the device. Talked during movies. Adopted impossible dogs. Trusted the wrong people, usually because she wanted to believe the best about them. Sounds annoying. She was. There it was again, that almost smile, brief and wounded. Nora felt something shift between them, subtle but undeniable. Not romance exactly. Something more dangerous in early form. Recognition. By 10:30 they were in position. Nora sat on the kitchen floor where she could see the living room through a narrow angle without being visible from outside. Julian was in the dark hallway outside her apartment with an earpiece and the key Mrs. Donnelly had once claimed not to copy for anyone. The police car was supposedly 2 blocks away. Rain threatened but had not started. The whole building seemed to hold its breath. At 11:06, the first movement appeared on camera too. Victor entered the building. No toolbox tonight. No maintenance vest. Dark jacket. Baseball cap low. Nora's pulse slammed. Through the earpiece came Julian's voice, rough and controlled. He used the master. On the kitchen screen, Victor paused outside 4C and listened at the door. Then he moved on down the hall toward the stairwell. Not entry, Julian murmured. Positioning. Nora looked toward the window. 1 minute later, a silver line crossed the dress form's shoulder. She nearly made a sound, caught it, pressed a fist against her mouth. The line trembled once, adjusted upward, steadied on the shape's head. Not a reflection. Not a random gleam. Aim. Got it, Julian said into the mic, though whether to her or Moreno she could not tell. Then the line vanished. Victor reappeared on the hall camera and returned to her door. This time he crouched, took something from his pocket, and inserted it beneath the frame. A thin black strip. Fiber optic. He was looking under the door. Nora's skin turned to ice. Move, she whispered. No, Julian said. On screen, Victor withdrew the optic line and stood. He seemed to hesitate. Then he lifted his head and looked directly toward the hidden camera as if he could feel eyes on him through the wall. The apartment buzzer rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Nobody she knew used the building buzzer at this hour. Victor stepped back from the door. In the alley below, tires screeched. A car door slammed. Shouts erupted on the street. Police are early, Julian said, and for the first time she heard uncertainty in his voice. The hallway camera jittered as Victor bolted toward the stairs. Stay down, Julian snapped. Nora disobeyed instantly and crawled to the living room gap in time to see chaos break across the alley. 2 men were running from the opposite building toward a black SUV idling with rear lights dark. One carried something long wrapped in cloth. The other wore a hood. A third figure appeared on the roofline above them for one impossible second before dropping out of sight. Then a gunshot cracked the night open. Not from the alley. From the hallway outside her apartment. Nora's body moved before her mind did. She lunged to the door, yanked it open, and saw Julian on one knee near the stairwell, one hand braced to the wall, his other gripping Victor's wrist. Victor held a small pistol. The muzzle had scorched plaster inches from Julian's shoulder. Victor slammed the gun hand against the rail. Julian twisted. The weapon clattered down the stairs. Back inside. Julian shouted. Victor wrenched free and drove his shoulder into Julian's bandaged arm. Julian made a sound stripped raw by pain. Nora snatched the motion alarm from her pocket and hit the side button. The resulting siren was monstrous. Victor flinched hard enough for Julian to hook his ankle and send him crashing to the floor. The whole hallway filled with the screaming electronic howl. Apartment doors flew open below. Someone yelled. Feet thundered on stairs. And then, from the roof access above, came another sound. 3 measured knocks. Nora looked up. So did Julian. The door at the top of the stairwell shifted inward by an inch. Someone had been in the building above them the entire time. Julian's face changed in a way she would remember all her life. The anger vanished. The focus vanished. What remained was recognition so cold and absolute it looked like prophecy fulfilled. He shoved Victor toward the stairs and rasped, "Run, Nora." She did. Not down. Up. She hit the roof door with both palms just as the figure beyond it burst through. The man wore black work clothes and a city utility vest over them, generic enough to vanish in daylight. Average height. Gloves. Mask. In one hand, a narrow suppressed rifle. In the other, a flashlight with red film over the lens. Everything about him was designed to be forgettable except his eyes, which were pale and calm and emptied of anything a normal person would recognize as hesitation. He swung the rifle toward her. Nora grabbed the door edge and slammed it sideways. The metal caught his arm. The rifle discharged with a muffled spit into the frame. Julian hit him from the side an instant later, driving both of them onto the rooftop in a violent tangle of limbs and rain-slick fabric. The roof was black glass under the first sudden sweep of rain. Nora stumbled backward as Julian and the masked man hit the gravel hard enough to slide. The rifle skidded toward the ledge, bumped once against the low parapet, and stopped. For half a second the only sound was rain and breath and the dying scream of the motion alarm still echoing somewhere below. Then the attacker moved. He was fast in a terrifying, economical way of someone who had rehearsed violence enough that it no longer looked emotional. He drove an elbow into Julian's throat scar and rolled free. Julian came up choking but already reaching. Their shadows lurched across the roof in the red beam of the fallen flashlight. Nora's first clear thought was absurdly practical: if he gets the rifle, we die. She ran for it. The weapon was heavier than she expected. She grabbed the sling and nearly lost her footing on the wet surface. Behind her, Julian and the man collided against a vent housing with a metallic crash. The attacker's mask half shifted, just enough for Nora to glimpse a thin mouth and a line of old pitted skin across one cheek. He saw the rifle in her hands. Everything in him changed direction toward her. "Nora!" Julian shouted. She didn't know how to use the gun. She didn't need to. She swung it sideways like a bat as the masked man reached her. The stock cracked against his forearm. Pain shot up her wrists, but the impact knocked him off balance for one precious second. He lunged again. She dropped the rifle entirely and shoved the red-lensed flashlight into his face. He recoiled from the burst of scarlet brightness, not blinded but disrupted. Enough. Julian drove into him from behind with a force that carried all three of them toward the roof edge. Nora fell hard, skinning both palms. The flashlight spun away, staining the rain red as it rolled. She heard a grunt, a curse too blurred to catch, then the awful scrape of shoes on wet stone. When she looked up, Julian and the man were locked at the parapet, each trying to control the other's center of gravity. The attacker had a knife now. Thin, bright, viciously small. He slashed once. Julian jerked back, coat splitting at the ribs. Nora grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a loose brick used to prop open the roof access in summer, and hurled it with every bit of strength terror gave her. It struck the attacker's temple with a sickening thud. He staggered. Julian took the opening and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The two of them smashed against the parapet. For an impossible moment the attacker seemed suspended there, balanced on decision. Then one gloved hand shot out and caught Julian by the front of his coat. They went over together. Nora's scream tore itself from somewhere beneath thought. She scrambled on hands and knees to the parapet and looked down. Julian had managed to catch the rain gutter of the lower service roof one level beneath. The attacker dangled from Julian's coat with one hand and the parapet edge with the other, boots scraping uselessly against brick. 30 feet below, the alley glimmered with police lights and open umbrellas and people spilling into doorways to watch. "Let go!" Julian shouted. The man looked up at him with a face that had finally become visible under the shifted mask. Not Victor. Not any tenant Nora knew. Late 40s, maybe. Blunt nose. Colorless eyes. An expression not of panic but irritation, as if gravity were merely an inconvenience. "You ruined months," he said. His voice was calm enough to freeze blood. Julian's injured arm shook violently. "Let go." The man's gaze moved past him to Nora at the parapet above. Recognition flashed there. Cold satisfaction. "There you are." Nora's whole body convulsed with horror. Below, voices shouted. A police officer pointed upward. Someone was coming onto the roof access behind her. She did not turn. The attacker smiled. It was the worst thing she had ever seen because it was intimate without affection, directed at her as if he had known her longer than she had known herself. Then his knife hand came up. Not toward Julian. Toward the fabric of Julian's coat where his own weight depended. "Julian!" Nora screamed. Too late. The blade sliced through the wet wool. The man dropped. He struck the metal fire escape one floor below on the way down, bounced once, and disappeared into the alley amid a spray of shattered rainwater and screaming witnesses. For one blinding second Nora could not process the rest of the scene because the fall consumed all thought. Then she saw Julian's remaining hand slip on the gutter. She vaulted the parapet before reason could stop her and flattened herself onto the lower roof, sliding through rain until her stomach hit the ledge above him. She caught his wrist with both hands just as he lost purchase. The force nearly pulled her over. Julian looked up, rain pouring over his face, blood mixing with water at his ribs and throat. "Nora," he rasped. "Don't." "Not helpful," she choked out. Footsteps pounded behind her. Detective Moreno dropped to the roof beside them with another officer and grabbed Julian under the shoulder. Together they hauled him over the ledge in one brutal movement that left them all sprawled on tar paper, soaked and shaking. For several seconds nobody spoke. Rain hit the roof. Sirens wailed below. Julian lay on his back staring at the sky as if he didn't trust the fact that it was still above him. Moreno rolled to her knees first. "EMTs are coming," she snapped. "And if either of you ever run an independent operation in my city again, I will arrest you both on principle." Nora started laughing. She couldn't stop. It came out wild and breathless and close to tears. Moreno stared at her as if assessing shock, which was fair. Nora pressed both scraped palms over her mouth and laughed until it fractured into sobbing. Julian turned his head toward her. Even now, even bleeding, even half unable to speak, his first clear focus was checking whether she was alive. That undid her more completely than the fall had. The attacker was dead by the time the ambulance doors shut. Victor was in custody downstairs, shouting that he had never killed anyone, that he only opened doors and checked schedules and passed on names. Mrs. Donnelly was being questioned in her robe beneath a police umbrella that did not hide the fury on Detective Moreno's face. The black SUV in the alley had been stolen 2 days earlier. In the back, Officers found binders, zip ties, burner phones, and a small box of jewelry labeled by street. Among the jewelry was a single silver hoop earring. Not from a prior tenant. Lena's. In the ambulance, while an EMT cleaned the cuts on Nora's hands, Julian sat across from her with his shirt open at the ribs and his eyes half closed from pain. For the first time since she had met him, he looked exhausted enough to stop fighting it. "You were right," she said softly. His eyes opened. "About too many things." "No," her voice shook. "About me." He watched her, confusion moving slowly through the fatigue. "You knocked now," she said, remembering. "Because you finally knew for certain." A long silence passed between them, filled with sirens and rain and the rustle of medical packaging. Then Julian answered in the barest voice. "No. I knocked because I couldn't bear to be late twice." The aftermath did not arrive as relief. It arrived as paperwork, flash photography, statements repeated to different people in different rooms, and the strange violation of hearing strangers discuss the details of your fear in brisk procedural tones. By dawn Nora had answered the same questions so many times she felt detachable from her own life, like a witness describing a woman she had briefly rented. Detective Moreno brought coffee that tasted burned and sat with her in a hospital consultation room while rain faded into a colorless morning outside the narrow window. "The dead man is named Conrad Vale," she said. "Former building systems contractor. Fired from a property management group 6 years ago over theft allegations that never stuck. Since then he's worked under subcontracting arrangements, temporary municipal badges, emergency maintenance calls. Which means he could get into places without being memorable." Nora wrapped both hands around the paper cup for heat she couldn't feel. "And Victor?" "Accessory. Maybe more, depending on what forensics gives us." Mrs. Donnelly admits he offered cash to keep tenants' complaints quiet and to notify him when women in certain units lived alone. Nora closed her eyes. Moreno continued more gently. "We found records in the SUV. Schedules. Building layouts. Observation notes. He was meticulous. That's a nice word for it. It's an accurate one." The detective set a folder on the table but kept her hand on it. "There are items and evidence linked to other women. Some families may contact you later if they learn you were involved in stopping him." The idea made Nora nauseous. It also made the room feel larger somehow, as if the walls had shifted to include lives she had never seen. "Julian said the police stopped listening," she said after a while. Moreno's mouth tightened. "Sometimes he gave us evidence in pieces. Sometimes he spooked victims by watching too closely. Sometimes my department failed anyway." She held Nora's gaze. "All of those things can be true." Nora respected her for saying it. Honesty had become rare enough to feel almost medicinal. Julian was 2 floors above with 6 stitches at his ribs, a strain to the shoulder, bruising everywhere, and instructions not to leave. He left anyway 4 hours later and appeared in the doorway of Nora's temporary hospital room wearing borrowed scrubs under his coat because the nurses had confiscated his torn shirt. "You're impossible," Nora said. "So I've heard." His voice was little more than gravel. She should have made him go back to bed. Instead she watched him cross the room with careful stiffness and sit in the chair by the window, as if windows had not ruined enough already. For a minute neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was crowded with everything that had nearly happened and everything that had. "Moreno filled me in," Nora said. He nodded. "Conrad Vale." Another nod. "The utility vest was fake." "Yes." "He had Lena's earring." Julian looked out the hospital window at the pale city beyond it. His face gave away almost nothing, but grief had changed texture now that it had a name to attach itself to. Less abstract. More lethal. "I'm sorry," Nora said. His gaze shifted back to her. "You didn't do that." "No. But you've been carrying it alone. Something moved in his expression then, not quite softness, not quite surrender. Fatigue, maybe, stripped of its armor. He looked at the 4-line in her hand, the bandages on her palms, the bruise darkening along her wrist where she had slammed into the parapet, and exhaled through his nose. So have you, he said. She wanted to argue, but the truth was too fresh to deny. The old version of herself, the one who apologized for needing locks and curtains and peace, had not survived the week. Something in her had broken, yes, but something else had hardened in the correct direction. Later that afternoon Moreno returned with a victim advocate, a locksmith referral, and a blunt recommendation that Nora not go back to 4C until the forensic team had finished. That suited Nora perfectly. She never wanted to see the place again. Then Moreno added, almost casually, that management records for the building had gone missing from the basement office sometime before dawn. Missing how? Nora asked. Water damage, according to Mrs. Donnelly. Conveniently selective water damage. Julian pushed himself upright in the chair despite the pain. Victor had keys to the office. Victor had keys to several places he shouldn't, Moreno said. We're sorting it. But if Vale kept backups, they may not need the originals anymore. The victim advocate, a calm woman named Elise, handed Nora a packet thick enough to stun an ox. Emergency housing resources. Counseling contacts. Security upgrade grants. A paragraph about post-traumatic symptoms that managed to sound both kind and terrifying. Nora accepted it with the numb gratitude of someone being given instructions after a plane crash. When they were alone again, she reached for the television remote mounted to the bed rail and switched on the local news. The screen showed rain-dark streets, police tape, and the blurred entrance to her building. Another city mystery explained just enough to entertain strangers. Nora clicked it off. After that, she slept for the first time without dreaming of windows. When she woke after sunset, the room was dim and blue with evening. Julian was gone, but on the side table beside the untouched gelatin cup lay a folded note in his cramped, careful handwriting. Went to give Moreno copies. Back later. Lock the door. She stared at the message for a long time before folding it once and slipping it into her coat pocket, not because it said anything tender, but because it sounded like the closest thing to trust he knew how to write. It was absurd that 4 practical words on torn paper could steady her breathing, but after everything else, absurdity no longer felt like a convincing objection. Sunday settled over Tessa's house with the kind of warmth that made the windows glow from the inside. By late afternoon the kitchen smelled like baked cheese, basil, and garlic, and every surface seemed to be holding a bowl, a spoon, or a child's abandoned project. Nora stood at the counter grating Parmesan while cartoons echoed from the living room and Ben searched for the good serving spoon with the grim concentration of a man preparing for ceremonial combat. It should have felt crowded. Instead it felt steady. The world had not become safe in any magical sense, but inside this house, for a little while, it behaved like it remembered how. You've checked your phone 8 times, Tessa said, not looking up from the lasagna. I'm checking the time. You checked the time 40 seconds ago. Nora set the phone face down. You are deeply irritating. That's what makes me effective. At 6:11, headlights crossed the front wall. Ben looked toward the window. Brooding neighbor passes level 2. Be nice, Nora said. I am nice. This is my supportive face. Julian stood on the porch holding a bottle of wine and looking as if he had accidentally arrived at an event requiring emotions. He wore a dark sweater instead of the coat Nora had first associated with him, and without distance or shadow, he seemed less like a vigil and more like a man relearning the shape of ordinary evenings. Tessa opened the door, announced that no one escaped hugging in her house, and embraced him before he had time to object. The startled look on his face nearly undid Nora. Dinner unfolded awkwardly at first, then less so. Tessa's children demanded to know whether Julian had ever seen a dinosaur skeleton, whether scars hurt more in winter, and whether detectives got better Christmas presents than other adults. Ben asked practical questions with gentle precision, the kind that allowed refusal without punishing it. Tessa watched Julian carefully for 10 minutes, then decided he had passed whatever internal test she had designed and bullied him into taking a second piece of bread. Nora watched the whole thing with a quiet, incredulous tenderness she did not try to name. What struck her most was how attentive he was. Not performatively polite. Not trying to charm anyone. Just present. When the younger child handed him a paper flower made from a napkin, he accepted it with solemn gratitude. When Ben made a bad joke about security cameras at baby monitors, Julian actually laughed, brief and rough and real. The sound altered the room. After dessert, Ben took the children upstairs under threat of immediate bedtime mutiny, and Tessa began loading the dishwasher with the ferocity of a woman punishing cutlery for existing. Nora slipped onto the back porch for air. The evening was warm and blue, the yard silvered by porch light and dotted with fireflies. Somewhere beyond the houses, traffic whispered over wet pavement. Darkness no longer felt like something waiting to climb through glass. The screen door clicked behind her. Julian stepped out with 2 glasses of water. Tessa said this was safer than wine. She believes hydration can fix almost anything. He handed her a glass. Their fingers brushed. The touch was brief, but it moved through her with startling clarity. For a moment they stood side by side in silence. Moreno called, Julian said at last. Victor named 2 more men. Nora nodded. So it keeps widening. And you? She asked. What happens to you when this stops being the center of everything? He looked out at the yard. I don't know. That's allowed. A faint smile touched his mouth. You sound very sure. I signed the lease today. That gives me authority. His head turned sharply. Where? Brooklyn. 3rd floor. Bad tile. Good locks. Windows facing a tree. Relief crossed his face before he could hide it. Good. You can say congratulations like a civilized person. Congratulations. See. Growth. She leaned against the rail. I also called the counselor Elise recommended. He was quiet for a beat. So did I. Nora looked at him. You did? My appointment is Friday. That's brave, she said softly. He shook his head. Just overdue. Still counts. Julian looked at her then, fully. I kept hearing what you said in the hospital. What part? That stopping isn't betrayal. Nora set her glass on the rail. I meant it. I know. His voice roughened. That's why it was difficult. She smiled a little. You make every simple thing sound dangerous. Maybe because some of them are. Once, his attention had terrified her from across an alley. Now he stood close enough for her to see the faint healing line at his temple, the exhaustion not fully gone from his eyes, the care with which he held himself back whenever something mattered. Nora, he said. She waited. I don't know how to do this well. What is this? He gave the smallest shake of his head. Staying. Being in something that isn't built from fear. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, slowly enough to let him retreat. He didn't. You don't have to do it well tonight, she said. You just have to do it honestly. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then he lifted one hand and paused it beside her face, a question gentler than words. Nora answered by leaning into his palm. When he kissed her, it was careful and quiet and devastatingly sure, the kind of kiss that did not erase the world so much as return it in a kinder shape. The porch still creaked. Someone inside laughed. A cabinet shut. The ordinary sounds of life continued around them, and that was what made the moment feel real. Later, he walked her to the guest room door. She smiled up at him. Good night, she said. A near smile touched his mouth. Then he tapped 3 even knocks against the doorframe and said, "I'll see you tomorrow."